Let's take a look at some of the built-in functions that you can use in C. So first of all, the functions that are in the math header file. Some of the math functions include the square root function, the exp function that raises e to the power x, the natural log function. There are trig functions such as sine, cosine, tangent. Note that all of these are in radians. The pow function takes two input arguments. It raises x to the power y. There are two different absolute value functions. Abs is the absolute value of an integer x, and fabs is the float absolute value function. And then there are two functions, ceil and floor, that conceptually take a float and round it up to the nearest integer, that's what ceil does, or down to the nearest integer, that's what floor does. But they actually return floats. So for example, if you said ceil parentheses 3.7, that would round that up to the nearest integer 4, but actually returns it as a float 4.0. There are some random number functions that you can use. And first of all, in order to do that, there are two header files that you have to include. The standard library header file is stdlib.h. That's where the random functions are, so you have to include that. And if you want to set the seed, which is generally a good idea, the seed is obtained from the built-in clock, and the functions that do that are in the time header file. So in order to work with random number functions, you need to include both the standard library header file and the time header file. So setting the seed for the random function should be done only once in the very beginning of the program, and after that the random function can be called as many times as you want to generate random numbers. So to set the seed, you have to execute this statement. srand is the function. You pass to it time of null, so time is the function that gets the time from the clock. So this is the statement that you have to include just once in the very beginning of your code in order to set the seed. Now the random function itself is called rand. What it does is it generates random numbers, random integers in the range from 0 to rand max, where rand max is a built-in constant. So again, rand by itself will generate a random integer in the range from 0 to rand max. You don't pass any arguments to the rand function, and in C that means you have to have empty parentheses. So for example, you'd say rand parentheses to generate your random integer. Let's take a look at some examples and how you can modify that. So first of all, you can use the modulus division operator to modify the range of the random integer that is returned. So if you want to generate a random integer in the range from 0 to n, the way you do that is rand, empty parentheses, percent n plus 1. Now if you wanted to generate a random integer in the range from 1 to n, you would generate a random integer using rand percent n. That's actually going to generate a random integer in the range from 0 to n minus 1, and then add 1 to that, and that shifts to give you a random integer in the range from 1 to n. If you want to generate a random float, then you use the float cast operator and then divide by whatever you want. So that fraction is actually going to give you a float value with the cast operator. So for example, if I say rand empty parentheses percent 100, that generates a random integer in the range from 0 to 99, and then add 1 to that, shifts the whole thing up, so you get a random integer in the range from 1 to 100. If you wanted to generate a random float in the range from 0 to 1, and again you use the float cast operator, and you'd say rand divided by rand max, which is the maximum rand value. So those are some examples of using the rand function.